Hello, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Seems like we've got people still logging in, but it's 6:02, so I'm only going to give it, just a few more moments before we get started. But thank you for being here in the November 2021 Tenant Talk Live. Okay, so we'll give it just 1 minute and then we'll get started. Thank you for your patience. In the meantime, as we're getting started, let's do what we do every month. Could people please post in the chat box where you're joining us from, what organization you're with, what community you're in. We really appreciate knowing who's participating in these conversations, and we always really appreciate the chatter that you get going in the chat box. So feel free to get that rolling, and we'll give people another 30 seconds to join. All right, so let's get started, everybody. Just as a quick early reminder, we are recording this session. So please be aware of that for any time that you might unmute to ask a question and so forth. Please also, during this session, feel free to put a lot of questions in the chat box as we're going through updates about what's going on in housing policy. One update I have is you might have noticed that I am not Sydney Betancourt. I'm Joey Lindstrom. I'm joining to facilitate the call today on behalf of Sydney, who cannot be with us because she is caring for her dog who has fallen ill. It's very sad. But we got a good agenda, and we are going to get moving. We will do a little bit less of the disaster recovery content than we thought we would, because a couple of our guest presenters aren't able to join us because they've got some pretty active issues emerging in Texas where they're working, so they're dealing with that. But I'm glad we've got a big crowd today. Looks like about 30 of you, ranging from Tulare County out in California. We've got Mike from the Lake Forest Park Citizens Commission. We've got, it looks like Irma from Wisconsin, which is great. Deborah Olson from Oregon. Great to see you, Deborah. Evelyn is here from Oxnard, California, which is great. We've also got Bree Miller from South Metro, but I don't know what community. Catherine Johnson from Chicago, and Allison Johnson, a previous NLIHC award winner from Housing Justice League in Atlanta. We've got AJ from Racine, Wisconsin, where they make the really good Kringle pastries. Bambi Hayes Brown from Georgia is here. We've got Connie coming to us from National Coalition for the Homeless. Paula from Georgia, and Connie Jean Conklin from Western North Carolina. Kate's here from Seattle. Bree is in Colorado. Thanks for that correction. We got Tony here also from Georgia. So it looks like we're covering a good geography all throughout the country. And I'm hopeful that those of you who are here can communicate with one another in the chat box and connect like you definitely have in previous sessions. So let's get started. As you all know, we're going to be talking about disaster recovery as our special topic today. But before we get into kind of our special topic, there's a couple of things that are happening from NLIHC's standpoint that are high focuses, and one of them is very exciting. In fact, it is good news, and we don't get a lot of good news days in federal advocacy on housing policy, but we had a pretty historic one just last week. It's a piece of history that many of you get to be a part of, because many of you were part of the advocacy that presented this moment, which is $105 billion for our priority asks in the proposed Build Back Better Act framework that President Biden announced just last week. But don't listen to me babble on about it. Let's bring in Kim Johnson from NLIHC's policy team, who is going to break down what this new money means, which programs it goes to, and how this can really help us end homelessness and housing poverty. So Kim, why don't you take it away?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? There I am. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson, a housing policy analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And like Joey said, I'm here today so that he doesn't have to ramble on about Build Back Better. I get to do that. I get to ramble at you. So I'm very excited, as always, to join you this month. And thanks so much for tuning in. So last week, President Biden announced the framework for the Build Back Better Act, which totaled around $1.75 trillion, which is down from the $3.5 trillion initially contained in the bill, but still greater than the $1.5 trillion that West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin has been pushing as the top line funding limit. So the package contains $150 billion in affordable housing and community development investments. And that includes $25 billion to expand housing vouchers to up to 550,000 new households, $65 billion to make critically needed repairs to the nation's public housing stock, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to build and preserve over 150,000 homes affordable and available to households with the lowest incomes. So for the housing vouchers, about 22 of the 25 billion is allocated for housing choice vouchers, and another 1 billion is for project-based rental assistance. Of the amount provided for the vouchers, 7.1 billion is set aside for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness and survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual violence, and stalking, and $15 billion is set aside for households with extremely low incomes. The package also contains funding for other important housing and community development programs, including funding for down payment assistance for first-generation homebuyers, money to address lead hazards and indoor air pollution, funding for rural and tribal housing, housing for people with disabilities, housing for older adults, among other investments. And I think that one of my colleagues dropped our analysis of the framework in the chat. Thank you so much, Courtney. So together, this would be the most substantial federal investment in quality, stable, affordable, and accessible homes in the nation's history. And I want to take a second to acknowledge that while $150 billion is lower than the $327 billion allocated in the first draft of this bill, at the beginning of October, reports indicated that housing was going to be cut entirely from the bill. And thanks to the hard work of advocates across the country, like the folks on this call, and the leadership of members of Congress like Representative Maxine Waters, Pramila Jayapal, Richie Torres, along with Senators Sherrod Brown and Chuck Schumer, we were able to salvage affordable housing investments. So I wanted to take a second to say thank you to everyone on this call who called to weigh in with their members of Congress about the importance of these housing provisions, who shared an action alert, who got their friends and family to weigh in. Without that work, it's very likely that housing would have been cut altogether. So it is thanks to the work of you all that $150 billion, that historic investment, is still in the package. It is important to note, however, that we are not quite out of the woods yet. Nothing is guaranteed until the bill is signed by President Biden. So this week, the House will continue conversations on both the Build Back Better Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. We might see a vote on the Build Back Better Act as soon as this week. It's unlikely, though. It all depends on, one, how long it takes to work out the details of the bill, and two, getting Joe Manchin and Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema on board. The Congressional Progressive Caucus in the House has endorsed the bill, and Manchin said this afternoon that he would not support the bill unless he has a clear understanding of its cost and impact. But that's not really new news. The kind of demands that he listed this afternoon are essentially pieces of the reconciliation package that would need to be in place before it moves through the Senate anyway. So things like a cost analysis from the Congressional Budget Office. If anything, it just signals that the bill will likely move more slowly than we were hoping. So right now, we are asking people to keep the pressure on their members of Congress to vote yes on the bill until it passes the House and Senate. And I'm going to pass it back over to Joey to talk a little bit about how advocates can keep pushing until that bill is enacted.
Yeah, so before we move into that, I just want to really emphasize two things that Kim just said. One is that this really is a historic investment in housing. And even though the bill isn't over the finish line yet, there is reason to be optimistic that we can get it there, because the president wouldn't have released this framework and these specific numbers if he himself didn't feel confident that he can get it through the House and the Senate. So we all have work to do, but we shouldn't miss this moment to feel really good about what's happened so far and the progress that we've all made. And this really is built on the outreach that people like you have done throughout the country, getting in touch with your members of Congress and letting them know that housing needs to be prominently included in the Build Back Better Act. And if you ever wondered to yourself, man, does it really matter when I send an email to my member of Congress or when I make a phone call? Let this be your evidence that it does. Because as Kim was saying, just a few weeks ago, it really looked like affordable housing was going to be cut out of this bill entirely, and it was included prominently. And when we say affordable housing, in this case, we're talking about the programs that really matter to extremely low-income people. We're talking about public housing, we're talking about vouchers, and we're talking about the National Housing Trust Fund, things that focus on the extremely low-income people where the greatest needs are. So this is a really, really great moment. I'm going to turn to some advice about I'm going to turn to some advice about next steps, but first I'm just checking in on the chat box to see if people have any questions for Kim right now. Deborah has some concerns about vouchers in tax credit housing. Deborah, I'll ask you to explain those in a little bit, but for right now, I'm going to ask you to hold that question. And Allison Johnson put in a question in the chat. How do community development corporations and grassroots organizations fall under this plan? I think the best answer is, Allison, so a lot of the funding that's going to come through the Build Back Better Act. So for example, the billions of dollars, the 15 billion through the National Housing Trust Fund, or the 1 bill, or was it 10 billion for the home program, Kim, or is it 1 billion?
That would be 10 billion.
10 billion, 10 billion, thank you. Those are monies that will be used heavily by community development corporations, but in both cases, it'll be determined by the allocation plans in the states and communities that receive that money, right? But community development corporations will use a considerable amount of that money to build and expand affordable homes. Kim, do you want to comment more specifically on CDCs and grassroots organizations under Build Back Better Act?
Yeah, I would just add a couple more details from the Build Back Better Act about those community development provisions. So in addition to $10 billion per home, there's also $3 billion for community development block grants, as well as a new program. Sorry, no, I lost it. Oh, a community restoration and revitalization fund that would be funded at $3 billion. And that's a new program. And a lot of that funding goes to nonprofit organizations and grassroots organizations that apply for funding from their state government in order to receive some of that money for their own communities. So I would strongly encourage grassroots community leaders who are on this call to push to get some of a slice of that funding for themselves and their communities once this bill is enacted. And granted, it isn't enacted yet. I'm just speaking, trying to will it into existence.
Yeah, and I'll always remind folks that one piece of the puzzle is winning the money. The next piece of the puzzle is weighing in with your state, or in some cases your cities or counties, on how they should be deploying the money, right? So like if we looked at something like the National Housing Trust Fund, it could be used for new housing for people returning from incarceration. It could be used for tiny homes, right? It could be used for manufactured housing residents to buy the mobile home parks that they live in, and things like that, right? It could be used for a lot of different purposes. And where those purposes are decided is when states and communities create preferences in their allocation plans or their consolidated plans and so forth. But that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because we still have to get this bill passed. And Courtney on our team just posted into the chat box the link to reach out to your members of Congress. And that link has been updated because what we were saying until last week was, hey, Congress, when you put together the Build Back Better Act, you'd better include housing, right? Our ask now is no longer include housing in this bill. Our ask now is pass this bill. We need to get our members of Congress to vote yes, right? And depending on where you are, your members of Congress might need to hear from you for different reasons, right? So there are some moderate members of Congress who are feeling like the bill is really expensive and they want to make sure it's going to be paid for and so forth. There are also really progressive members of Congress, and they had things that they really liked in the much bigger, much more expensive bill that was put together. And this more compromised version gets rid of some of their favorite projects, right? And so some of those more progressive members of Congress, even though they lost something they care about, we still need to find a way to get them to a place where they will vote yes, right? So it might be moderates, it might be progressives. It is true that most of the people who will vote yes, almost all of them in a divided Congress, will probably be Democrats in this case. But if you're represented by a Republican, they need to hear from you too. Reach out to your members of Congress, let them know that housing is important to your community and that this bill will make a difference and that people in their district need them to show up and vote yes. So please follow that link that Courtney shared. It's got some suggested text for an outreach email. And if you want to get more information, Courtney also shared above that the summary of all the housing pieces in this particular bill. That link is in there. And at this point, I would like to throw it open for any questions. Deborah, I'm going to unmute you so you can just kind of ask your question about vouchers. It looks like you have some concerns about rent increases, I think, in the from Oregon Housing and Community Services. Let's see if I can successfully unmute you. You can go ahead, Deborah. No?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can, go ahead.
Okay, I have a Section 8 voucher and I live in Tax 42 housing that's supposed to be a little less than surrounding areas. And the Oregon Housing and Community Services has come out with their price list, 4% rent cap for buildings, 15% and older, and 9% for buildings, 15% and or 15 years and younger, you know, newer built ones. A couple of tenants with Section 8 vouchers have gotten their rent increase of 9% just in the last few days. A couple of us are going to the office tomorrow. The office at just GSL Properties in Lake Oswego had actually told the one tenant who got this notice that it was based off her income, not a rent. And it's the paperwork's quite clear, 4% rent cap, and GSL has been until the rent freeze. We had a 16-month rent freeze by Home Forward that ends in December. They were, doing the 9%. And going against the standards that's coming out of Salem's Tax 42 compliance office. So if Section 8 people are being rent gouged, the ones with vouchers now, it concerns me that when they go out everywhere else, including if they filled up the whole building, they're going to be, nailed to the maximum. And we're talking about somebody who gets $800 to live in, and their rent goes up $90. And the last rent increases that all my neighbors got, Home Forward paid zero of the rent increase. So that $90 came out of their check. And they're paying $360.
So Deb, let's follow up offline, because this sounds like there might be some kind of problem with the PHA, because obviously anybody with a voucher should only be paying 30% of their income, and the rent shouldn't go up unless
I agree.
their income goes up. I mean, that just shouldn't be happening. Like that shouldn't, there's no part of the process that should make that. And that doesn't seem to be related to the low income housing tax credit. For those of you on the line, when Deb's talking about Section 42, she's talking about low income housing tax credit housing. But if someone with a voucher shouldn't experience a 9% rent increase unless they had a 9% income increase. So let's follow up, and I think we can kind of work through
I can guarantee you, none of these people got $90 increases in their Social Security.
Right.
This year,
yeah.
they might get 50 in January. So,
Okay, thanks, Deb.
Yeah.
Other questions about the Build Back Better Act or how to get involved in this pivotal moment? There's a question here from Connie Jean Conklin, who I believe is in North Carolina. All of the funds will require having a 501c3. I don't necessarily believe that's true. I mean, all of the funds will be distributed by states and localities to entities that are incorporated, but it could be a for-profit entity. It doesn't need to be a 501c3 entity. Certainly that's true for the home program or for the National Housing Trust Fund. And I imagine that's going to be true as well for a lot of the community revitalization funds. I'm not aware that any of these require a 501c3 designation. I think there are probably some states or communities that would prioritize 501c3 nonprofits, but honestly, I don't even think that's very common. I don't know, Kim, do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I would agree with what you said, Joey. I don't think folks necessarily have to be part of a 501c3 in order to get that funding. Although, like you said, I'm sure there are some communities that will prioritize nonprofit entities to receive those funds. But yeah, there's nothing in the statute that says explicitly, oh, you need to be a nonprofit in order to receive these funds. Often it is for-profit entities as well as nonprofits. So I think it'll be fine for folks across the kind of spectrum to apply for that funding.
Linda Soderstrom in Minnesota also asked to share a question. So Linda, I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to contribute. Linda, are you there? You should be able to talk.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
Oh, I sound like that telephone commercial. Okay, I have a small, new, never funded not-for-profit. And so we're not really as well known as so many, we just want to buy like a house and then put some tiny homes in the backyard. So we want to house about 10 people, 3 or 4 tiny homes in the backyard and get past the NIMBY, and maybe 5 or 6 bedrooms in the house with an office. And we're just trying to figure out, how would we apply for this as a 501c3? What category of all these categories that you were just telling about would that fall under?
Well, my guess is in order to move forward with the tiny home project, you might need several pots of money, but certainly you could use home dollars or you could use National Housing Trust Fund dollars. These dollars certainly will be awarded competitively, and they will be awarded, if it's the National Housing Trust Fund, by the state. If it's the home program, either by the state or perhaps if you're in a larger city, it would be the city or the county. But so it's always competitive. Your organization submits a grant request, other organizations, other developers submit a grant request, and so forth. And so very often it's the case where they don't have enough money to award grants to all of the organizations that put in requests. However, now that there's considerably more resources, the state, the city, the county are in a better position to get closer to funding all of the requests that they receive. Maybe not all of them, but a higher proportion than they have been in the past, because they won't be carving up a small pie into a few pieces. They'll be carving up a big pie into quite a lot of pieces. So for you to know where to sort of submit your application to use funding,
Yep.
You'll want to be in touch with the community development offices of your state, city, county. And if you're not currently aware of what those are, just shoot an email to one of us after this call and we'll help you find it for your community.
Okay, real quick question then. So have you ever heard of tiny homes like on the grounds and the backyard and 5 or 6 bedrooms? This is all transitional and supportive in the same project.
My experience is I've never heard of a large community of tiny homes on one lot or one
Sure.
yard. Like it would certainly require a zoning reform, like a zoning change.
Yeah.
There are some places like in California or New Hampshire where if you built one apartment on your lot, if you built like a garage apartment or something like a pool house or something like that, those kinds of things are allowable. But putting 10 new dwelling units on one property, I'm pretty sure in most places is going to require some kind of zoning change. But that'll
Sure.
depend on local law.
Sure, they have a lot of big old mansions with 5 or 6 bedrooms, so we were just picturing some combination, but I see what you're saying. The other thing though is that the bigger groups are going to go for the bigger buckets because they're already ready because they're huge, and we're small, new, emerging. And is there anything set aside for that kind of program?
No, I mean, there's nothing in this funding that's specifically set aside for smaller organizations. I mean, I think the set asides happen when the money gets to the state and to the local communities. Kim, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, it sounds like we're going to have to just shame them into letting a small, new, emerging group like have a chance.
I mean, just demonstrate that your proposal is going to make a big impact. I mean, that's the best you can do.
Thank
All right,
you.
thanks, Linda. I'm gonna turn over now to Marie in Oregon, who's got her hand up. Marie, would you like to share? Marie, are you there?
Yes, hi, Joy. I'm just wondering, what are people going to do with these vouchers since people that have vouchers aren't moving, and the places where you can use them are so limited? And then, so are they making some sort of provisions for incentivizing landlords to accept the vouchers? Because in a lot of jurisdictions, they just flat out are turning them away. I'm in Oregon, and the thing is, we do have a legislation that was passed a while back where they supposedly have to take us, but what they've been doing is adjusting the rent so that it makes it a barrier. So what else can we do to make it so people can actually use the vouchers?
Kim, do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So that's a great question. First of all, we know that there's a huge issue with landlords being willing to take vouchers, which is always very confusing to me. It's guaranteed, like you're guaranteed to get money for rent. Why? Anyway, so we know that's a huge issue. Unfortunately, something like source of income discrimination couldn't be included in the reconciliation package because reconciliation has a lot of complicated rules that govern what can and cannot be included in the reconciliation package. And unfortunately, policy changes like source of income discrimination can't be included in the reconciliation package. Everything has to relate to funding. But there is funding specifically for landlord recruitment and retention efforts for those housing vouchers in order to get increased landlord take-up in the absence of source of income discrimination laws. That's a provision that's already in the Build Back Better Act. And Joey, I don't know if there's anything else you would want to add to that as well.
Sure. So first I want to acknowledge that one of the things that makes a voucher work is that there's actually a property that will accept the voucher, right? And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. Number one, there are a lot of properties that receive federal subsidies, like the low-income housing tax credit, who have to accept voucher holders as a result of getting that subsidy. But the other way you can make landlords more open to taking on a voucher household is by expanding the overall supply of available apartment units, right? And so that's why we're not just pushing for more vouchers, we're also pushing for more new housing through the National Housing Trust Fund. Because you're exactly right, Marie, that in many communities, landlords are just increasing the rent so that it's above the payment standard of what a voucher holder will pay, right? But it's really hard to do that when you're a landlord if increasing the rent means you're going to have an empty apartment, right? And that's a more likely scenario when there's a high vacancy rate because there's a lot of apartments out there in your community. So we kind of have to do both things at once. We have to increase the rent subsidies with the vouchers, but we also have to increase the supply of affordable housing through the National Housing Trust Fund. So we're building housing and we're helping people pay for it. But you're absolutely right, Marie. There's a lot of things that need to happen to make sure that the vouchers, once they get to communities, need to be used. So the landlord recruitment funds that Kim was talking about, the recruitment and retention funds, are for PHAs like Home Forward in Oregon to reach out to landlords, to educate them, to help them understand what the voucher inspection is, or help them understand that a voucher holder renter isn't going to destroy their property and stuff like that. So that's some really important stuff as well. So I'm going to take one more question, and I think we need to move on in our agenda, although this has been a really great conversation that we've been having. I'm looking, so there's a question here, Kim, is there any money in the bill for manufactured housing?
So I'm assuming manufactured housing refers to, I'm not 100% clear on
mobile home parks. Yeah.
Mobile home parks. Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, not anything specific to manufactured housing or mobile home parks. There is funding for a lot of different community-based programs, so things like, I guess area-specific programs, so like rural housing, tribal housing. There's a lot of funding for the construction of new housing for people with disabilities, as well as people who are older adults, so that they can age in place. I don't believe there's anything specifically set aside for manufactured housing, but I don't believe that there's anything necessarily saying that something like funding for the National Housing Trust Fund, say, couldn't be used for manufactured housing.
Okay, thanks, Kim. So just really want to close by emphasizing, please reach out to your members of Congress in the coming days, encourage them to vote yes on the Build Back Better Act. And with that, we will turn to a more brief update from Emma Foley on our research team, who's going to talk a little bit about the billions of dollars in emergency rental assistance that states and communities have right now, and the struggles that some states are having in getting that money out. Emma, what's the update?
Great, thanks, Joey. I'm just going to pop a few links in the chat so I don't get distracted. So first, I'll give an update on spending numbers for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that was released last Monday, and then talk a little bit about the recapture and reallocation process, which I don't think we've covered yet on this call, and what that might look like. And so according to new data, spending data from the Treasury for the month of September, emergency rental assistance programs spent $2.6 billion of ERA1, which represents $2.6 billion of ERA1, and together with past months, this represents 40% of the $25 billion allocation. Grantees have also started to spend ERA2, and spent $354 million of ERA2 in September. This brings the total amount of ERA money spent to $10.3 billion. State grantees spent 38% of their funding by September 30th, but there does continue to be an uneven spending across states. Several states, New Jersey, DC, New York, and Illinois, spent over 3/4 of their allocations, while 18 states spent less than 15% of their allocation by the end of September. Several of these states that have spent less than 15% of their allocation are particularly concerning because they house such a large number of low-income renters. Those include states like Ohio, Tennessee, Arizona, and Georgia. And you can see how much each state has spent based on the most recent data that we have in that first link that I dropped in the chat next to ERA spending. So these low spending states are particularly concerning because September's spending also marked an important milestone, because this data will be used to begin the process of recapture and reallocation. Since the last time this meeting was held, the Department Department of Treasury released various resources on how funds will be recaptured and reallocated. And without getting too into the weeds, because it's very easy to do, I'll try to give a broad strokes overview of the reallocation process. So all grantees that have obligated, meaning approved, less than 65% of their funds are required to submit a performance improvement plan to the Department of Treasury, which is due in 2 weeks on November 15th. Additionally, grantees who did not obligate at least 65% of their ERA1 funding and who spent less than 30% of their funding will be determined to have excess funds. The amount of funds taken back by Treasury will be based on the difference between how much a grantee has actually spent and the 30% benchmark set by Treasury. And if you're curious about whether your state or locality is at risk of having funds recaptured, that data is also in the second link that I popped into the chat under grantees at risk of recapture. The spreadsheet predicts excess funds based on 2 different scenarios. The first scenario includes the amount of funding that would be eligible for recapture if a grantee does nothing. And the second scenario is the amount eligible for recapture if grantees submit a performance improvement plan by November 15th. And this information is in the last 2 columns of the spreadsheet. This data can be an important advocacy tool because the program improvement plan asks that programs make concrete commitments to speed up funding dispersal. This includes commitments like getting programs to incorporate flexibilities like self-attestation and direct tenant assistance, to build up more robust outreach strategies, and to increase accessibility in ERA applications, among other potential improvements. I'm also going to share, after I finish talking, some links in the chat regarding reallocation guidance, as well as Treasury's performance improvement plan form that has a long list of things that programs can do to increase their spending. And NLIHC continues to track ERA spending using the most current data available. As of this morning, we're tracking over 12.3 billion that has been spent or obligated of ERA1 funding. And again, that more detailed data can be found in the first link in the chat. And I will stop talking for now. Happy to answer any questions.
So first question, Emma, is can you explain for folks what you mean when you say ERA1 and ERA2?
Yes. So ERA1 refers to the $25 billion that was allocated as a part of the 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act. That funding is can be spent through September of 2022. And so there is some urgency to get the funds out the door, both so that it does not go unused and so that it can quickly serve renters who need it. And then the ERA2 funding is a second allocation of $21.6 billion that has some additional flexibilities that I think we touched on this call last time, but one important one among them is that grantees must provide direct tenant assistance if their landlord doesn't participate, and also slightly changes the language of eligibility so that applicants do not have to have experienced a financial hardship due to COVID, but that they experience a financial hardship during COVID, which might open up the door for some additional eligible applicants.
Thanks, Emma. So for those of you on the call, you've heard us talk about emergency rental assistance a bunch of times, but I think what Emma's talking about today is really important in terms of how some of that money can be recaptured if your state or community isn't spending it. This is money that can be used to help people who are behind in their rent become current overnight, right? You know, I mean, well, not overnight, there's a process, but in many states and many communities, the average renter is having 12 months of rent paid. I mean, we're seeing that in several places. And I also want to emphasize that emergency rental assistance can be used for people who are homeless to pay for move-in costs, security deposit, first few months of rent. So there's really important uses in your community. And I really want to encourage you to take a look at the links Emma shared, because that's how you can see if your community is at risk of sending money back that could be used to solve the housing needs of people who you work with and who you see every day. So definitely make sure that your community is doing what they need to do to find the people who can use up this money, because you don't want to waste it. You don't want to send it back. Let's see, any questions for Emma? I'm not seeing any raised hands right now. All right. So Emma, please stick around if you can and answer any questions that pop up in the chat. We will turn it over now to what was really our main topic. We spent a lot of time talking about the Build Back Better Act because that really is the big news of the day. But long before President Biden put out his proposed framework for the Build Back Better Act, we wanted to talk to all of you assembled here about the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. This is something that the National Low-Income Housing Coalition has been working on for several years, bringing together a lot of housing organizations that care deeply about making sure that impacted communities, including low-income people and including renters, are able to get back on their feet after a major disaster. We've worked really hard to see that FEMA implements the Disaster Housing Assistance Program that over the past several years they have refused to do. The Disaster Housing Assistance Program, of course, is a rental assistance program for people in impacted renter communities to help pay their rent for some time after the disaster. So we work with lots of state and local organizations so that they can be a part of the advocacy that we do with Congress and with FEMA on disasters, but also so that they can be connected to one another and so that they can be connected to audiences like your own to share a little bit about how disasters can impact low-income communities and what resources and what opportunities are available. So we're really delighted and fortunate to have with us today Tami McVay from Self-Help Enterprises. Self-Help Enterprises covers, I believe, several states. Tami can correct me if I'm wrong, but they're very big in California. And many of you know that in the rural parts of California, there have been major housing losses to some of the wildfires that have happened over the past several years. And Self-Help Enterprises has been on the front lines of deploying some of the recovery resources and helping some of the people who have lost housing as a part of these tragedies. So the rental housing implications can be twofold for people in terms of disasters. Sometimes it's renters who lose their housing. But sometimes it can be a different kind of problem because sometimes the disaster only impacts homeowners. But those homeowners who lose their homes, they now have to find someplace to live. And now there's suddenly way more renters than a community maybe can sustain. And so there's all kinds of affordability problems that spill out. So I'm going to turn it over to Tami to do a little bit of introduction of Self-Help Enterprises, the types of programs that they run in response to disasters, and how some of that really matters to renters in communities like yours. And for those of you who haven't experienced a major disaster in your community recently, first of all, congratulations. But second of all, it's good to be aware of these programs so that you're ready with your advocacy when that moment arrives. So Tami, I'm going to turn it over to you to take it away.
Great, thank you so much. That was a great introduction. So I'm going to carry you every time I have to do a presentation. I'm going to ask you to come and do my intro. So my name is Tami McVay, and I am the Assistant Director for our Partner Services program. However, what I do is I primarily oversee all of our emergency services work. For those of you that aren't familiar with California or with Self-Help Enterprises, Self-Help Enterprises covers the Central Valley. So we are smack dab in the middle of the valley, or in the middle of the state, and we provide services to 8 different counties, and that is considered the San Joaquin Valley. So some of the services that we provide as far as emergency services have been drought-related services. So the drought has hit us really hard here in California, especially here in the Central Valley, and especially in our very rural areas where a lot of tenant-occupied housing is. So one of the things that we do is whenever families are living off of domestic well and their wells have gone dry, we can go in, and instead of them living with no access to water, we install an emergency water tank and we have water hauled to them, while we also work with the owner of the property to get a new well drilled, and making sure that whenever we get that new well in place, we do rent restrictions, which means that just because we have a new well in place doesn't mean you can't up the price of the rent for the resident that's living there it was a grant to the owner, so we're going to go ahead and not make that reflect, on rent increases to the resident. So that was one of the things we do. We also test for water quality, which making sure that, families aren't just out in the middle of the country or in very rural areas drinking water that comes from wells that could be contaminated. So we're able to go out and test water. And then if it does have contamination, some of the work we do is we provide bottled water until we can figure out what that contamination, like what exactly it is and how we can filter it out. And so we install either point of use devices, which are, people know them as ROs. They're the under the sink device where you can have your own little faucet and you fill up your glass of water and that's where you drink from, to putting in point of entry devices. And that is a filtration device that goes straight on the well and filters all of the contamination that goes into the house. Typically, we do that type of device because of the volatile chemicals that we find, or the volatile compounds like 1,2,3-TCP. And now my mind is going to go blank on all of the different contaminants that we test for. But we're also working on looking at emerging contaminants because we really do want to make sure that when we say you have safe water, that we really mean it. So we work closely with our state water resource control board to make sure that we know about emerging contaminants and we stay up to date on that. And then again, it just goes back to having that is free to the owner of the property. And so it will not be reflected in rent increases, and there is a maintenance program offered. So we would continue to go out and test and change out the filtration. So none of that is a cost burden on the resident or the owner. Some of the other work we've done, I think that's kind of, the drought is kind of what started emergency services for us. We really saw a need that wasn't being fulfilled for our residents. And as we went, as that started in like 2016, and as we got deeper into the drought, deeper into water quality issues, and then we started having wildfires, we just really recognized that, man, we talk about sustainable and resilient communities, and what does that mean to us? We need to make sure that we can make it through these disasters and still be standing, not just survive, but we really want to thrive. So we started looking into other funding, and we were lucky around that time. The governor released Listos, California, which was an emergency preparedness campaign. And we applied for a couple different counties in our service area, and we were awarded one, which I'm glad right now that we were awarded one, because we didn't know COVID was going to come into the mix. And when that happened, we really did expand our scope of work. And we were only in one county, but we were able to reach out to, oh gosh, I know Nicole's going to tell me after we're done with this that I probably said the wrong number, but we were able to reach out to over 30,000 residents in Tulare County alone and educate them on how to be prepared for a disaster. And that is talking about flood, fire, earthquake. When COVID came in, we really expanded that scope and started talking about COVID awareness and, washing your hands, the campaigns that you saw, we put billboards up. And I want to say that we were closer to 100,000 educational reaches that we were able to do to families throughout the Tulare County alone. So that kind of bled into other counties, but we got to sponsor vaccination clinics. We got to sponsor test sites. We also reached out to the homeless, and we did a social bridging campaign. So senior citizens who were sitting at home feeling very scared, we were able to do a call to them and say, we're just here to talk to you, be a friendly voice on the phone, and have a conversation that wasn't us trying to sell something, but us just being there for them. And in addition to that, we were able to deliver over 50,000 gallons of bottled water to tenants throughout our entire service area that would have been considered at risk and couldn't go to the stores. We had water donated to us when folks heard what we were doing. We had water donated to us by Nestle, and we were able to deliver over 50,000 gallons of bottled water just to keep people safe and at home. Then Housing is Key came out, and we were able to be one of the lead groups. I think there's like 6 tiers now, and we're a tier 6 leader for Housing is Key, which means we meet with the residents throughout our service area and help them apply for the rental assistance program. So if they were affected by COVID, we can help them go in and apply for those funds. And we also follow through to make sure, if they've been awarded the funds, if it's something is still pending, if we need to help them fill out something else on their application, because I did just get a note. Nicole is listening. I'm sorry, Nicole. It looks like 300,000 is how many we actually touched, not 100,000. She's letting me know now. So that was part of the work that we did. We were, oh goodness, well, where did I go? That was part of the work was, Housing is Key. So we follow through with them. We really listen to the residents whenever they call in. Tenants are scared, affordable housing is a major crisis across the nation, and here in the Central Valley, having any type of affordable housing available, everything we see is, investors are coming in and taking over those properties, and we're being left with not very much as far as affordable housing goes. So tenants are just afraid, and part of the work that we do is we sit and we listen and we counsel. Just listening to the families, listening to what they're afraid of, and trying to relieve some of that stress from them by helping them get through the paperwork process. We also have utility assistance, which is it's our HCD CDBG funding. So each one of our counties and cities partners, we are administering funds that can help fund up to 3 consecutive months of any family who has past due utilities. That can be a renter or an owner. So it doesn't matter if you're renting or owning the property. We can come in and assist you. And then we also offer mortgage assistance. So some of those landlords who were struggling through COVID because maybe their tenant wasn't able to pay rent because maybe they lost their job, we can offer mortgage assistance to some of them as well. I think I've kind of covered all of that. We also had the pandemic relief fund where you didn't have to do anything. It was a very simple form, but if you said, hey, we've lost our employment or we're underemployed because of COVID, we could give you a gift card to the family and Visa credit card to the family, and then they could go out and purchase groceries or whatever it was. And we didn't ask questions. There was no monitoring. That was all donated funds from our donors, and we were able to use at our discretion.
Thank you so much, Tami, for that excellent overview of some of the work that you've been doing at Self-Help Enterprises in response to some of the recent crises that have been going on. One of the first questions that we got in was related to some of the water testing that you were doing about housing quality. How is it that you were testing for sulfur in the water? How were you making those evaluations?
So residents call in. We do a lot of outreach into our communities, and we let them know that we're there. A lot of the times we're just there with our presence, and folks get curious. So when they call into it's our water quality line. When they call into our water quality line, they say, hey, we're curious if our water is contaminated. Sometimes, especially here in the Central Valley, where it is primarily ag land, you usually have that runoff from the chemicals, the chemicals for, oh goodness, now I can't think of what they're called, pesticides and insecticides. So, we have nitrates in the water, and that's really big and kind of known around here. So they'll call and say, we think we have nitrates, or we think we have arsenic. And so we go out and we test for what we call for water systems, it's a Title 22, but for domestic wells, we can't call it that because domestic wells aren't monitored. So we just call it our own version of the Title 22 test, but we test for I think, 10 primary contaminants: lead, copper, and in mountain areas, we test for gross alphas. But the resident has to call in. They have to tell us that they think that their water is contaminated, or they just tell us that they have a well and they're curious. So we go out and test, and then, we take it to a certified lab. The lab runs it, tells us what the results are, and we go back and explain that to the resident and what those health effects could mean, the negative health effects could be.
Thanks, Tami, for that answer. Our next question is one that might fall out of your expertise. Let me know, and I can do an answer as well. But under non-coronavirus conditions, what are the typical steps that renters would take to get rehoused if they were displaced due to a disaster?
So yeah, that's actually one of the most difficult ones that we've dealt with, especially as of late. We struggle, like I mentioned earlier, with affordable housing shortage. There's a housing shortage, and then there's an affordable housing shortage, and all of it in the end is a shortage. And when residents are displaced because of a disaster, one of the things we found where there is a huge deficiency, and we're currently working on some policy stuff right now, trying to find longer term housing, because what we've been able to do is reach out to resources, but there's nothing really in place at this moment. And we have lots of families that are being affected by the wildfires and also by drought. Luckily for drought, we're able to put emergency tanks in and they can stay there, but there isn't a permanent solution. But when fires happen and there is damage to the home and they can't return, unfortunately, we are struggling to be able to find that assistance. So I don't know if you have anything, Joey, but I'd love to hear it, because we are I think at least every other week, we meet to discuss how we can keep this moving forward. One of the things we've noticed is our funds, that the funds that are out there right now are so siloed and very specific. So it had to be a 2019 fire in this area in order to fund this person. So we're working to remove those silos, make it disaster related, not just this fire in this area at this time. March 13th, 2019, it was this fire. We want to remove those and see what we can do to assist with housing. But if you have anything, please let us know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tami, for that answer. I can tell you, Marie, that whenever there is someone displaced by a disaster, the first thing to do is to go to FEMA and make sure that an assistance request is in fact filed. In most cases, what FEMA has available are either trailers or motel rooms for the short term. And very often we find that the short-term housing, usually for 60 or 90 days, can be found if someone gets through FEMA successfully. And I say successfully because sometimes FEMA has really weird documentation requirements, specifically weird for someone who just got flooded out of their house, or if their house burned down. Sometimes the application process can be strangely and unnecessarily burdensome. But the motel programs and the trailer programs very often work, though they might not work as quickly as people would like. The real problems that we find is when those temporary solutions expire, it's not like the apartment somebody was renting is now back online and they can just move in. Very often they have to go find a new place and start over. And it's what happens when that motel program comes to an end. How do people move in somewhere else? And that's why the disaster housing assistance program is so essential. We're at 7 o'clock now, Eastern time. So I've got to close it down. I do see that we've got some more questions in the chat and the Q&A. And for anything we didn't get to in our conversation, we're going to try to reach out and provide answers in the follow-up notes. Also, thank you to our panelists for joining us. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Tami, for all of this excellent information. Thank you, Courtney, for providing so many wonderful and helpful links in the chat box. As always, if you have suggestions for future topics for Tenant Talk Live, please reach out to Sydney Betancourt on our team, or myself, or any of us. Sydney's email is sbetancourt@nlihc.org. Reminder that Tenant Talk print edition is available online. So you can go down and download that, or you can request a print version if you haven't already gotten one in your home. And then finally, if you can, please remember to join the Tenant Talk Facebook page, which is a great space for renters such as yourselves to share ideas and updates about what you're working on and to try to interact with one another. So we've got a lot more follow-up to do, but I want to thank everybody who participated today and those of you who unmuted and asked your excellent questions. And we look forward to talking to you all again next month. Bye, everybody.